Joining me today is Dr. Benedict Beckeld, the author of this book, Western Self-Contempt, Oikophobia and the Decline of Western Civilizations. All right, Dr. Benedict Beckeld, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you very much for having me.
I loved your book,
Thank you.
Western Self-Contempt, Oikophobia and the Decline of Civilizations. It hit me in a way that I think the way that reading The Strange Death of Europe by Douglas Murray in 2017, The Parasitic Mind by Gad Saad, in the sense that it's so relevant to the current moment, and even The Quest for Cosmic Justice by Thomas Sowell. So I hope, my hope is that everyone will be talking about and thinking about this term oikophobia, because it's just so relevant. But I wondered if we could start, if you could explain what that term means. I heard it, a guest on this show, Dr. Jeffrey Bale, mentioned your book and that term in the context of the decline of Western civilization. So I wonder if we could start there.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you first of all for your kind words. And the term, as you say, oikophobia, it's one that I, for one, have been endeavoring to make better known, and with some success, at least if one looks at appearances of it on Google and X and so on. It has gone up in recent years, so that's good. It's trying to make people more aware of this concept. But so basically, oikophobia, from the Greek, of course, fear of home, is basically the diametrical opposite of xenophobia. So just as some people might fear or loathe the stranger or the foreigner, xenophobia, so too there are people who fear or loathe or hate their own home, their own culture, their own society. And what has not been very well understood, and that's one of the things that I try to establish with this book that you mentioned, is the notion that this is not some strange new thing that has suddenly appeared in late 20th and early 21st century decadent Western societies, but is in fact something that has appeared in earlier iterations of Western decadence. And so that in order for us to understand why we are going through this, that we're currently going through, we have to understand that this is in fact a repeated phenomenon, and it is basically a part of the fabric of the West. Now, in a way, that could be somewhat depressing news, because if we're able to say that this is just some sudden strange perversion or mental illness even, then it might be easier to kind of brush it under the rug and say that, well, we're going to get past this soon. It's just a little bit of a hump in the road. But in fact, no, we know that this is something that happens under particular socio-historical circumstances going all the way back to ancient Greece, which in a way, of course, then makes it more difficult to combat, because we know that this is something that keeps coming back. But on the other hand, at least if we understand it, then we can also hope to combat it in the sense that we understand how to get past it as well, because we can see also in history what has happened as a result of this particular phenomenon. And so oikophobia is basically what happens as a society, as a Western society in particular, goes toward its decline with too much wealth, too much security. Obviously, security is a good thing, and wealth generally is a good thing as well, but these can have, of course, cause regressive tendencies as well, where people forget what they have. They forget their traditions. The backsliding of religion is a part of that as well. Religion is a cornerstone of every society, and so when atheism arises on a mass level, that also contributes to the forgetting of one's traditions, including non-religious traditions, because so much is bound up with religion. So that's basically a very brief overview of what oikophobia is.
Yeah, and it's very interesting in the book. You start with ancient Greece, obviously. I was struck by a number of markers, I guess oikophobic markers, like even vegetarianism.
Yeah.
So there's nothing extraordinary about what we're experiencing now. But what are the phases of this taking hold of a civilization? I think the first one was, you mentioned self-awareness.
Yeah.
So what are the phases?
Yeah. So self-awareness is definitely one of the earliest signs that one.
And what does that mean, just for people?
Yeah.
Self-awareness of a society, a civilization. What does that mean?
Yeah, it basically means that one stops taking one's own superiority as a society for granted, and that one starts to look and analyze one's own traditions, one's own beliefs, in a more dispassionate way, which of course is a good thing. I mean, science and many forms of progress, both philosophical, scientific progress, rely on this kind of dispassionate capacity to observe oneself, to look at one's own society in the mirror. And the Greeks, the Athenians in late 5th century BC Athens were really the first Westerners to do this. And so part of the tragedy of oikophobia is that, and part of the tragedy of Western history writ large, is the fact that these things, which we call decadent today, and which cause this, which has this corrosive effect on society, start with things that are actually in and of themselves good things: the ability to analyze, the ability to be more objective, and so on, which obviously I think most of us would say are good things, and part of also what makes the West great. Not to say that Westerners are the only ones who are able to self-analyze, but it has been a stronger feature in Western societies than in many non-Western societies. And so that is the first phase. You mentioned Greece, and indeed that's where we find it the first time. Dramatists, philosophers, and so on, they start to question their own gods, their own religious traditions, their own myths, and so that in and of itself is not oikophobia. This can be done by people who are still very patriotic, such as Aristotle and Euripides are some names I mentioned. They're very patriotic people. They love Athens and Greece to some extent as well, but they have this analytical mind. But then, obviously, human beings being what they are, we can never take something just so far and no further. We're always going to go all the way and do too much of something, and so that self-questioning then leads to an attack, and the what is dispassionate analysis finally becomes passionate again, but in the other direction. So the passionate defense and attack, which is characteristic of the earlier phase of society when we're more xenophobic or more self-aggrandizing, returns, but now in the other direction. And we become passionate and rabid, if you will, against ourselves and in favor of other civilizations. And certainly, having forgotten the existential threat that societies often face in their early histories is a part of that. If we're being threatened by invasion from the Russians, or in the Greeks' case, from the Persians, then of course one is not going to start attacking one's own civilization, at least not on a mass level, because everyone sort of has to rally together to face that exterior threat. But once that threat has been defeated, and one is no longer thinking about it because it's such a remote possibility that something like that would happen, then one starts, and this then leads into the second phase, one starts to attack other members of one's own civilization, because we all need to compare ourselves against something. It's a natural human impulse to see, well, what are other people doing, and how do I stack up to them? And which can be a good thing. It can be a driver of ambition and excellence and so on. There's kind of a friendly competition, but of course, once again, we take it too far. And when we've lost the capacity to compare ourselves favorably toward external enemies, then we start to compare ourselves favorably toward our own society and toward other members of that society, to show how enlightened we are and how better we are than the people around us. And so oikophobia latches onto that, and that leads to a kind of a self-hate. So we have basically the initial phase of a society is when it takes its own superiority for granted. No other possibility is even conceivable. Of course, we're better than everybody else. And then you have that more dispassionate, self-analytical phase in the middle, which is also a good thing in the sense it contributes to science and philosophy and so on. And then finally, the phase where society becomes oikophobic, and it now starts to hate itself. It takes for granted, just like it took for granted that other civilizations were inferior, now it's taking for granted that other civilizations are superior.
Right. And you mentioned also there are some circumstances that contribute to this, the external threat, obviously, of some kind of foe.
Yeah.
But also the absorption, in the case of Greece and Rome, the absorption of other cultures and tribes that sort of dissolve the identity of the culture.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
what else? What are the circumstances like that that bring this about?
Yeah, so there's definitely a demographic element there. That was stronger in Rome, and obviously very strong in our own case today than it was in ancient Greece. This is actually why you find some traces of oikophobia when it comes to Greece, you find some traces of oikophobia earlier in the Greek periphery than in the Greek heartland. So, for example, in Ionia, what is today Western Turkey, where there is more of a mix between Greek culture and Persian or Lydian culture, there is oikophobia there, or at least traces of oikophobia before that happens in Athens, because Athens is still kind of very parochial at this time and not exposed, as you say, to other cultures. So the same kind of pattern is visible in Greece as well, but not as clearly, because Greece, certainly Athens, never becomes this. I mean, it does later on, in the Roman era, but during the heyday of the classical and Hellenistic era, Athens doesn't become as demographically mixed as Rome does later on, several hundred years later, and certainly not as much as we are today. But so the demographical the mixture, if you will, of various cultures and ethnicities and so on, that is very strong in Imperial Rome, certainly late Imperial Rome, but even in mid and somewhat early Imperial Rome. And basically what it means is that other peoples that are absorbed, and this is again as a natural consequence of a society's success, because of course the more a society is able to be influential and to spread itself out, the more it's going to incorporate other peoples or other cultures and cultural memories in its midst, something which has happened certainly in Western Europe, here in the United States, and of course in the Roman Empire. The more it's going to be the case that these new peoples do not really have the same kind of fealty to the traditional idea of the realm, of the nation, as the earlier, as was the case in earlier eras. And when it comes to Rome, you see this in the sense that, for example, after a certain point, there are so many Greek-speaking senators from the eastern part of the empire in the Senate in Rome, that the whole idea of Romanness, of a pride in the Latin language, Latin literature, and so on, disappears, because it has become such a hodgepodge of different cultures. And of course, that's the case now as well in the United States, and certainly in Western Europe. We see it more extremely in Western and Northern Europe, of course, because they have taken in a much larger quantity of Islamic immigrants or migrants from the Middle East, from other places too, but primarily, of course, from there. We have the problem here as well, but it's not as pronounced, although a lot of American conservatives, I guess maybe because they're looking over at what's going on in Europe, they're kind of waking up to this problem as well. And so that's not to put the blame for this problem uniquely, squarely at the feet of the migrants, of course, because there's still plenty of natives who encourage this, because they have become oikophobic. But it becomes a sort of symbiotic relationship, because of course the more oikophobic we are, the more we invite other people to come in and settle, because we hold our own culture to be worthless, and that in itself then of course creates a vicious cycle, if you will, or a vicious circle by which everything becomes worse, because we become more oikophobic and the migrants don't have that kind of fealty to our traditions anyway.
And there seems to be, you mentioned relativism in the book, whereby oikophobic natives, if you will, consider other cultures, even immigrant cultures, to be superior to their own, or have this romanticism for the other that Rousseau described. So you mentioned relativism, the feminization of society as well, and a kind of cultural apathy.
Yeah. So relativism is a big one that also starts in Athens, and basically the philosophical idea that there are different forms of relativism, but we're talking here mainly about cultural relativism, the idea that a particular culture doesn't have a monopoly on truth over any other culture. Now, there might be some truth to that, in the sense that what one culture does isn't necessarily what's right for another culture to do. Certain things depend on a particular circumstances. A very parochial Islamic culture, for example, that's highly patriarchal, might not be ready for Western style 21st century liberal democracy, for example, which is not to say that. So it's not to say that everybody should be the same way, but it is to say that you can have that kind of degree of cultural relativism, understanding that different cultures need different things, while still having a culturally and morally realist position, in the sense that, well, for us here, it's still better to be this way, right? It's not to say that anything goes in our society. We still have to have our way, even if it's okay for other people to have their way. But so relativism comes in vogue in late 5th century BC Athens. A lot of discussions about convention versus law, like is something true or is something good because it is in and of itself, absolutely, or simply because we think that it is. And so that kind of a debate makes oikophobia easier to establish. It makes it easier for oikophobia to establish itself, of course, because if we can say that our culture has no particular claim to truth, then it is easier, of course, to weaken that culture. And we see relativism is always bound up with oikophobia in the modern era as well. There's also positivism, which is the opposite of relativism, which says that, well, there is actually something that is better and that is higher, and that we have to progress toward that goal. So positivism is bound up with progressivism in the sense that, well, we have to reach this higher, more enlightened form of a society, which requires us to undermine our own traditions in order to get there. Positivism doesn't appear in ancient Greece as strongly in that sense. That's a more modern invention, especially with the French Enlightenment and later, already to some extent with sort of 5th century Christianity, but certainly with the Enlightenment. But the thing, so both positivism and relativism can fuel oikophobia, even though they're each other's opposites. And you often find that a lot of oikophobes, they don't realize that they're contradicting themselves. On the one hand, they say, all cultures are equal, or everybody should have the right. Every culture should have the right to do what they want, and our culture has no special claim to fame. And yet, at the same time, they have a very clear idea in their minds of what a perfect society should be. They're progressives at the same time, not realizing that there is a tension between these two ideas. But they use both ideas because both ideas can fuel oikophobia, and both ideas can be used to undermine one's own civilization, one's own traditions.
And how does religion come into this equation of oikophobia?
Yeah, so religion always goes hand in hand. The weakening of religion, I should say, always goes hand in hand with the rise of oikophobia. I mentioned before that that this kind of middle phase is the questioning, the dispassionate self-analysis of one's own traditions, of one's own customs, and so on. That, of course, then also involves the questioning of one's own religious traditions, of one's own gods or God, which again can help fuel science and philosophy. But when it leads to the rejection of religion, sort of as a matter of course, religion becomes the idea of religion, the idea of God becomes a sort of ridiculous notion. Like, of course, how can anyone believe such things? When that's the case, then oikophobia comes in as well, because, as I briefly mentioned before, religion is so important. A sense of the sacred is so important for society that when religion is discarded, almost everything else is discarded with it, including non-religious, or at least apparently non-religious elements. And this is what a lot of people, especially people who might be inclined to agree with me on many things, but who are more anti-religious, they need to understand that religion is not just the belief in some magic man in the sky, this kind of very childish and almost comedic view of what religion is. Religion is also a sense of the sacred, and what religious people have, which a lot of non-religious people do not have, is this sense of the sacred. Even if one doesn't believe literally in a God, it is still very important for society to have this sense of the sacred, that there is something set apart that is sacred to us, that is our tradition. And once God disappears as a support for that sense of the sacred, when the sense of the sacred itself disappears, everything disappears, because tradition is something sacred. Tradition is something around which a group of people can gather and establish a sense of community. So the importance of religion can't be overstated.
That's interesting. And what is the final cycle? So what is the downfall of the civilization once all of these factors have come about? You have a weakening society, a weakened identity, a self-hatred. What does the actual collapse look like?
So that's where we're a little luckier today than people were in the ancient world. In the ancient world, of course, much of the planet was inhabited by primitive peoples who had no compunction about invading and sacking Roman cities and so on. So which is not to say that oikophobia, of course, is the only cause of civilizational collapse. There are many causes. We touch on demographic, it even be agricultural causes, natural disasters. There are many different things that contribute, of course, to civilization's collapse. But oikophobia is certainly one of them. The cultural cause should not be underestimated. And so, if one is a 5th century Roman, then one is out of luck, especially if one lives in Rome itself. Then one will suffer invasion and pillage and burning and so on. Today, we're a little luckier, of course, because much of the world is quote unquote civilized, at least in the sense that even if we here in the United States have become oikophobic and decadent, we're not going to have Mexican or Canadian armies streaming into Los Angeles or New York and pillaging and burning, of course. But what the similarity is, at least, that we are going to have our societies are going to become less civilized in the sense that, to go back to the earlier point, we still invite elements that are hostile to our society to come in and settle. And so it's not, our social collapse is not going to be as dramatic, if you will, as social collapse often was in the ancient world. Our societies can still continue to exist and, sort of get along, more or less plod along, but they are going to lose vitality. They're going to become less safe, and so on and so forth. And once again, we see this more clearly, even though we have our problems, of course, here in the United States itself. And I'm thinking, especially in my case, I live in New York City with our fresh mayor, who certainly is not somebody who appreciates American tradition.
Yeah.
I could go off on a whole tirade there, but I guess I'll leave that maybe for another time. But we have in major cities in Europe, we see this more clearly and have seen it for some time. You go to London, Brussels, where I was just a couple of months ago, or Paris, Stockholm, etc., Berlin. One sees the fruits of this kind of social collapse, in the sense that, again, the country still exists, and you can still have a decent life there, but the society is losing its vitality, losing its vigor. Traditions are becoming more and more difficult to uphold. Safety is reduced, and so on and so forth. So it's a more gradual process.
Yeah. I think Mamdani's victory in New York, like, what could be a bigger marker of civilizational decline, surrender, self-loathing, all of those things. And to my mind, it seems that I'm less interested in Western Europe because I think it's almost too late. For Western Europe, you have disarmed populations, and their oikophobia seems more advanced than in America.
It is.
And the lack of freedom, the censorship that you have in Europe as well. But is it a fait accompli for a civilization? Are there any examples of reversals of oikophobia? And then separately, I wondered if there are examples of this in the Islamic world, like with the Ottoman Empire or other empires.
Yeah. So both are interesting questions. When it comes to the first question, whether there is a reversal of this, historical speaking, not really. We do see.
So we should just give up.
Well, no. So that's exactly absolutely not. So this is actually why I wrote, as you will have seen in the book. That's why I wrote the epilogue. There's a pretty long epilogue.
Yeah.
That epilogue hasn't been so appreciated because it is the most technical philosophy of the book. So a lot of non-specialist readers haven't, as I've noticed, haven't quite understood what I'm trying to say there. And so I've been accused of a certain doomsday outlook, simply because the epilogue is actually more optimistic or positive than some people appear to have noticed. But basically, to put it very briefly, we should not be slaves to history, even if we cannot see very concrete instances of a reversal. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, obviously. And if anything, we've talked about the importance of American tradition. Nothing would be more American than to say that, well, we're going to be the first ones to actually do this and to reverse this. And we do see examples of this. I mean, even for earlier civilizations, no social development is a straight line. It's always a zigzag. And so we certainly see times in which oikophobia is not stamped out completely, but at least pushed back to some degree, and then maybe it comes back again later on, and so forth. So it's a zigzag motion. But obviously, in this country. I mean, when Donald Trump won re-election in 2024, everybody was saying, woke is dead and so on. Now that was already exaggerated, of course. Woke is certainly not dead, but it was, and you could tell there was a kind of a bit of a cultural moment, where one could tell that, okay, some things, like it's cool to be patriotic again, that sort of thing. And so that was, again, not a complete reversal, but it was at least a pushback on oikophobia. When people started to express their patriotism in a more unabashed way. So those things are certainly possible, and of course we should build on the momentum from that. When it comes to, I mean, I kind of agree with you that it's probably too late for Europe, but certainly here in the United States, it depends a little bit on which European country. It's not inconceivable that if one particular country manages to pull itself together, that it could have a bit of a kind of a mimetic effect and encourage people in other European countries as well. Remains to be seen, but I'm not optimistic. I am more optimistic about the United States, though, because again, we should have the attitude that we shouldn't be slaves to history, and also there is the idea that once, which is an idea that I also discuss in the book, or maybe not in detail, but I do mention it, namely the idea that once things have become bad enough, sufficiently bad, there is the possibility that a cycle can start anew, basically. That things will have become so bad that there is basically a reignition of patriotic fervor. Often, unfortunately, such restarts are violent, but there is the possibility, at least, that there will be people will have become so humiliated that they will effectively rise again and restart the cycle anew. They will then become very very xenophobic, very self-aggrandizing, jingoistic, but at least it will start the cycle anew, and so they will push the enemy back and continue from there. So that can happen as well. Long story short, we shouldn't give up. When it comes to your second question on whether on the Islamic world, so and the non-Western world, so there is oikophobia in the non-Western world. A bit of a misnomer, or not a misnomer, but a misunderstanding one often hears from conservatives is that this is only the West. This is a bit of a reactionary oikophobia. Some conservatives nowadays, they love to attack the West because they see how decadent we've become. And so we attack the West and say, look how ridiculous we are. And all these amazing non-Western civilizations, they don't hate themselves. It's only we. And so there's kind of a reactionary oikophobia where conservatives start to attack the West from that direction. But the fact of the matter is that oikophobia does actually occur in the non-West, and not to the same degree, but and not exactly for the same reason. Oikophobia in the West is a homegrown phenomenon. Usually starts from domestic intellectual movements. It's stimulated by contact with other societies, yes, and by demographic changes, but it starts as a homegrown movement, whereas non-Western oikophobia comes as a result of overwhelming Western influence, basically. You have Western societies that see all these modern, fantastic inventions and elements of progress that the West have accomplished, and so they start to desire that, and they start criticizing their own more traditional ways in response to Western superiority. So that does exist in many non-Western countries. When it comes specifically to the Islamic world, you see that to some extent. I mean, the so-called golden age of Islam, which in my own humble opinion wasn't actually that golden, but maybe golden in comparison to what was going on in Europe at the time, but not really golden in comparison to golden European eras. But the so-called golden age of Islam, you do have a lot of Islamic scholars and scientists, philosophers, and so on, who did not take their religion all that seriously, which in part is what allowed them to accomplish the kind of progress that they did. And this is a bit the logic of the left. Whenever there is a European advancement or a Western advancement, that supposedly happened in spite of Christianity. Whereas whenever there was an Islamic advancement of some kind or an Islamic invention, that is all to the greatness and glory of Islam, even though in many cases such innovators in the Islamic world did not take their religion very seriously. So, but of course they apply a lot of left wingers. They apply that logic on only one side. But so you do find in certain Islamic eras, not full-blown oikophobia as we have it today, but a certain restlessness, a certain distancing from one's own tradition that comes with success, and that comes with the defeat of their in their case, their Western enemies. And of course, the Ottoman Empire after World War One, obviously, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk made a very conscientious effort to Westernize and to suppress what he considered some of the more noxious and parochial Islamic traditions. So, and you see the same kind of thing in Japan, for example, the Meiji Restoration, where they wanted to suppress traditional elements of samurai Japanese culture in order to Westernize. Bit of a difference there, though, is that they did those things in order to become more powerful. They realized that in order for us to beat the West, we have to be more like the West. And so, in a way, that's not oikophobic in the sense that they wanted to compete with the West. But they were smart enough to realize that some of their own traditions stood in their way on that front. But so it's kind of partial oikophobia, if you will. So we see the tendency as well in the Islamic world. It's just that because of the overpowering nature of Islamic dogma, that has never gone as far there as it has here.
Yeah. And I was thinking about, as I was reading the book, about my own history of becoming an oikophobe myself.
Sure.
At a certain point in life, after growing up during the Cold War and watching, Rambo movies, The Miracle on Ice, like very patriotic. We had a clear foe with Russia. And then after the collapse of communism, this period of, I would say the height of it was the Iraq War and films like Team America, World Police, just this like complete and utter superiority of America and perceived lack of a threat, probably leading up to 9/11, where I participated in that. I think I was fully oikophobic. I moved to Europe and felt embarrassed. I think a lot of kind of cosmopolitan Americans feel embarrassed about being American. I experienced that myself when I was living in Spain in the late 90s. But it was, interestingly, the exact experience of living abroad, both in Spain and Turkey, that made me appreciate America. And, 9/11 happened. And then most recently, in 2016, the kind of populist revolt, and seeing what I perceive to be the crossing of red lines of a democratic society, and actually waking up to recognizing that I think we do have an exceptional society in America and civilization, and wanting to defend it and feeling patriotic about that. So I've had sort of a reversal myself, but I wondered what makes me different. I'm an amateur student of history, I would say. I've lived abroad. But what makes me different? What makes people more susceptible to oikophobia? Because I feel like among us now in America, I feel like I'm living amongst zombies, people who are just captured. And I'll ask a second question after this, but I foresee a possible solution to this related to narcissism, which is one of the things that you touch on in the book, narcissism and pseudo-intellectualism among oikophobes. So to simplify that long-winded question, why do you think some people become oikophobic and others, let's just use America as the example.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, you're speaking to my heart there as a European immigrant, and someone who's lived in not just in the country where I was born, but in many other European countries as well. I always tell I'm an American citizen now by naturalization, but I tell many of my fellow Americans that they don't know how good they have it. So it's an interesting question, and that's I think where we enter a little bit more upon individual psychology. You mentioned narcissism. It's tempting to say that just oikophobes are just, people who are stupid, they don't understand but that's a little too facile, because you have some oikophobes who, at least in a superficial sense, are highly intelligent. In fact, the more educated someone is, oftentimes the likelier he is to be an oikophobe. Of course, it's something that pervades academic institutions. And I give a bit of a list in the book of why that's the case. But I think what you said is the more accurate answer, namely narcissism, vanity. I think people who are especially tempted by oikophobia are the people who have a tendency or a predilection for vanity, for narcissism, which is not to say, obviously, that a patriot, that all patriots are humble, kind people and so on. No, but there is the main motor of oikophobia is the desire to raise oneself above one's fellow citizens, to say, well, you see, look how better I am than you a bunch of parochial rubes, and I am the one who's enlightened and progressive and cosmopolitan and so on. And that kind of personal vanity is something that even Greek commentators, Plato, for example, comment upon. They don't use the word oikophobia, of course, it's a neologism, but it's clear that they notice that kind of vanity as well. It's commented upon in the ancient world as well. So I think that's a big part of the answer. People who lack a certain kind of gratitude, because I think part of the conservative position, I don't actually consider myself a conservative, but I think part of the conservative position is, or at least should be, a sense of gratitude for what one has received, for what has been handed down over the generations. Even if one is discriminating in terms of what parts of that tradition one prefers, what parts of that tradition one does not like as much, nonetheless, one appreciates the fact that men have labored through the centuries and through the millennia to build and to make what we have today, scientifically, philosophically, culturally, on many different levels. And so I think that an antidote to this kind of way of thinking is a sense of gratitude. People often say that the key to happiness is gratitude. That's a bit of a cliche, but I think there is a lot of truth to that, in the sense that if you are grateful for what you have, then you're naturally not going to be an oikophobe, because you're going to appreciate your society and everything that you've been given. I do think that a personal inability to feel gratitude and a personal vanity and this kind of narcissism that you mentioned, I do think those are the main reasons why somebody becomes an oikophobe. Sometimes it's just crass competition. One needs to, and especially in the academic world, one needs to find a way of rising above the fray. Uh, it's a bit of a cliche, in philosophical or academic circles, that everything of interest has already been said. Now, I don't think that's true at all. But if one has this kind of attitude that everything of interest, everything important has already been said, well, then one has to become increasingly outlandish in order to still make one's mark. And that, so this kind of competition, peer competition, also leads to this kind of oikophobic outlandishness. So that's part of it as well. But I think vanity and narcissism are the main factors.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned gratitude. I live in Southern California in basically like a sea of, I would say, toxic positivity and performative gratitude. So the signaling of gratitude without actually experiencing it yourself. I'm driven by narcissism, but I wondered, my goal, now with raising awareness for appreciation, defense of freedom in Western civilization, so many of the people in this country on the left are so, there's a childish narcissism to their viewpoint that I perceive. So I wonder if they learned about oikophobia and that they are basically victims of history. There's this idea that there's something that they are doing and thinking now is sophisticated and unique, when in fact it's actually like very base, and a cycle that's been repeated multiple times in history. It's ordinary. And these people are driven by status, narcissism. So could the awareness of oikophobia itself among leftists lead to the resolution of oikophobia, if I make myself understood?
No, it's
a paradox.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think not always, of course, but at least in some cases, yes. And it's actually something I've noticed myself, because it's a very interesting kind of thought experiment. But you do see it in the real world as well, that people, because part of what fuels oikophobia is this sense of I am unique, I am enlightened, I'm better than everybody else. and I'm pointing out the sins of my fellow citizens to them. Well, so there's kind of this idea of wanting to hold up a mirror to one's own society and see, look how bad you are. Holding up a mirror to one's fellow citizens and see, look how evil and parochial and racist you are, and so on. Well, what they're not expecting is that we hold up a mirror to them and say, well, look how what you're doing is actually something that people have done through millennia, and that it's not that you are so unique or clever, it's that you are a response, you are a child of your time, really. And so there's nothing cosmopolitan about you. There's nothing progressive or unique about you. You are what you're supposed to be at this time. You're a puppet. And I have seen cases where people, it's we live in the real world and not in a Hollywood movie. So it rarely happens that oikophobes will openly say, "Oh gosh, I've seen the light now." But I have seen several instances where oikophobes, people who are very clearly oikophobic, have kind of been given pause by this and sort of and they grow a little silent, and so that's always satisfying when that happens. And so I do think that that's certainly a possibility, because again, to show the genealogy of a particular thought isn't to reject the thought in and of itself. That's, of course, that's a mistake that people on the left often make, that if we can say that the origin of this had something to do with racism or oppression or something like that, that means that the thing itself is bad. Of course, that does not follow. And so too, we can't say that just because they are children of the time, therefore the idea itself is wrong. The idea still has to be rejected on its own merits, which is also something that we can do, of course. But it certainly helps as a matter of cultural propaganda, if you will. It's certainly useful, yes, to point out to people that actually they are at least as much children of their time as the supposedly parochial, racist people that they are criticizing. And that kind of historical demonstration through the ages is useful in that regard. I definitely think so. Yeah.
Good. I'm going to use that out in the test. I'm going to test that out in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds good. I would like to hear the results at your end. I do it here at my end as well.
How do you view, as far as contemporary America is concerned, and I go back and forth thinking about this Trump administration as either like an episodic like death rattle of a carcass of America, like an interlude, or are we headed for a reverse and like a generation of American greatness, like the golden era that Trump, as he likes to speak about it. But are things like, most recently the raid in Venezuela, foreign military conquest, I felt like that was at least an injection of masculinity and American greatness, at least like in a kind of cultural way. But also this talk of acquiring Greenland. So are there things that delay oikophobia and recapture, I guess, like the mythological kind of feeling of a civilization? Are there things that that could still happen, that are levers to still pull to prolong this thing?
No, definitely. I think so. And I think this kind of mythological pull that you mentioned is a good phrase. I definitely think that's possible. And there is, you even see this in less patriotic countries, when there is some brief exercise of power, how people love it. I mean, I remember this was several years ago, but France was on the way to a couple of decades ago to do a little military action in West Africa. In a former colony, and as the French aircraft carrier, or what they would like to call aircraft carrier, they have very cute aircraft carriers, sailed past the harbor, how Frenchmen were standing and cheering at the harbor and so on, saying, so there is a natural attractiveness in that, even for people who are otherwise not so typically patriotic. But I certainly do think that's possible, and the exercise of American power is a stimulant to that as well, assuming, of course, that the exercise goes well. Vietnam is, of course, the typical counterexample, exercise of American power that did not go as well, and so if anything had an opposite effect. But assuming that it goes well, and so far Trump's interventions certainly have gone well, that can certainly be something that pulls back in the opposite direction. I am inclined to think that America's best days are probably behind it. I hope that's not true, of course. But if we look at our historical trajectory, at least historically speaking, that would be the case. Again, I think we should. I don't think we should be slaves to history, but just judging historically, that would be the case. But we can certainly pull things in a better direction. This is where a demographic problem. This is probably where demography is the biggest danger, if you will, because that's something that is the most difficult to change and to reverse. As we see, I mean, people were talking about, when Trump is elected, he's going to have 11 million illegal immigrants thrown out of the country. And a lot of us at that time said that even if we were technically to be in favor of such a policy, it's going to be almost impossible to effectuate. And we see that now. I mean, they're having trouble ejecting even just people who have committed brazen crimes, not to mention people who are just here legally, but without subsequently having committed crimes. And so the demographic problem is really the biggest one, because as long as that continues, even if the native or more native population becomes more patriotic, that is still going to that problem is still going to continue to fester and to grow worse. Specifically in the United States, our politics are so volatile due to the fact that we have a two-party system that there's a very great risk, and this is my worry, that precisely because we have this, or in part at least because we have this success now from the Republican side, there is of course going to be a backlash, and we see this now. I mean, the more successful the Republicans are, the more successful Trump is, the more outlandish the Democrats become. And the more absolutely insane some of their policy suggestions. And once you have a candidate, once you have a general election between a Republican and a Democrat, even if it's a strong Republican and a weak Democrat, because people are used to voting a certain way, whoever is the Democrat nominee is always going to have at least, maybe a 30% chance of winning or something, even if it's a weak candidate. And a lot of it is going to come down to just superficial things like who ran the best recent campaign ad and so on. And so that's where this would actually be less of a risk if the Europeans ever managed to pull themselves together, which is highly questionable. Because they have because most of them anyway have parliamentary systems, they're more difficult to undo. Whereas here it can flip either way, on a dime. And so my worry is that if we get an AOC, for example, as president in 2028, or somebody like her, then so much of this could be undone overnight. So that's something that's a particularly American danger. So the fact that we have our volatility is both a positive, right, and a negative. It's a positive because we can see how quickly a clear Republican electoral victory can make a difference, something that is much more difficult in the inertia of Europe. But of course, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, this could all be turned back, but starting in the midterms.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really appreciated about your book, you make clear that it's not it's a historical analysis. It's not a value judgment of human beings who wind up becoming oikophobic, or it's just a cycle. It's natural.
Yeah.
And I feel like in the present, the last 10 or 15 years, discussions of such things, emotionalism immediately gets injected into this. People get called racists, or are basically ascribed bad intentions or evil intentions just for having like an intellectual discussion or a historical analysis of something that is so natural and historically rooted, like just the parallel between ancient Rome and the present moment with immigration, there were foreign soldiers in Roman legions, etc. Like this isn't like an emotional value judgment sort of thing.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you about kind of shifting gears a bit. The proliferation of one of the things I was struck by, your book is so dense. There are so many citations. It's a really dense historical work. So you have that, and now you have like history podcasters and these kind of very popular amateurish people who don't face the same rigor, but have a huge influence seemingly in our culture. So how do you view that, and is this part of oikophobia itself, like this kind of pseudo intellectualism, or like a kind of amateurish ness of thought and craft and trade and rigor and merit and all of these things? I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a double-edged sword again, I would say. Just briefly on your first point there about the emotional nature and of this whole topic, one can see why. One can see why, of course, I would be attacked, or the book would be attacked from the left, but I've been attacked from the right as well, for precisely for this reason, because of this sort of analysis and these citations, and the fact that I say that it's something natural, because a lot of people, or some people at least on the right, don't want to say that it is something natural. They want to say that this is something sick, a kind of mental illness, and so on. And maybe to some degree it is, but there is the reaction to oikophobia is sometimes so rabid that it leads to an anti-intellectualism, which I guess actually also goes toward your second question, or your second point. This anti-intellectualism that says that, well, we just want foot soldiers. We need to defeat this thing, and anything that appears to be philosophical or dispassionate and to kind of try to analyze, we don't need that. We just want people to fight this thing. Sorry. And so that's a bit of a negative reaction from the right. For this reason, I try to explain that, well, foot soldiers is good, but foot soldiers are good, but we also, some people are thinkers, some people are soldiers, and that's as it should be. The one shouldn't exclude the other. But as to your point about the amateur podcasts and so on, and by and large, I actually think it's a good thing, because I don't want there to be a monopoly on truth. In a way, I mean, this also is a slightly academic point, actually something I'm writing about right now, that I don't want. I want the debate to be broader, if you will, and I want the participants in the debate to be more numerous. Now, it's important. I still think it's important to be able to distinguish between academic and non-academic work, in the sense that it happens too often. And again, this is also a pattern that has existed in the past. It happens too often that non-specialists will lecture specialists on certain topics. Because of the democratization of knowledge, we all have more access to information than used to be the case, and that leads to amateurs or to non-specialists lecturing specialists. Now, a specialist doesn't always have to be right, of course. Experts can be wrong, obviously, as we see quite often. But it is still important to keep in mind. It is important not to reject expertise because it is expertise, which has started to happen a bit too much on the right. So the whole amateur ecosystem that has arisen, I do generally think is a good thing. But going back to a perennial point, we human beings always take a good thing too far. And when this ecosystem has started to reject intellectualism and expertise in and of themselves, because they are intellectual, because they are expert, that's obviously not a good thing. But by and large, I like that people are having these kinds of conversations. Especially maybe on a somewhat personal note, but for somebody like me who is rejected and unappreciated in academic circles, to put it mildly, I appreciate that there are still that the debate has become broader, that there are many non-specialists who are interested in these topics and willing to discuss them and to have that kind of an exchange, and that there is a broad audience for these things. So on a personal note as well, I'm of course very much in favor of it. As long as we don't lose sight of the fact that study, that analysis, that dispassionate observation is also important, and that it can't all just be a question of mudslinging and bomb throwing and so on. As long as we keep that in mind, I think this is a good thing. But the anti-intellectualism we see that more on the right than on the left. But of course, the intellectualism on the left has become so insulated that it's become a sort of pseudo-intellectualism. I think especially the left-wing academic ecosystem would be very benefited from an influence from this more right-wing or at least nonpartisan amateur ecosystem that we see. But as is so often the case, the more progress one side makes, the more the other side will dig in and refuse to have absolutely anything to do with it. So I don't see, unfortunately, much hope that the left wing or the academic ecosystem would come to its senses. But yeah, by and large, I think it's a positive development.
Yeah, great. And then my last question is about technology and how technology kind of folds into oikophobia, and how you see, I guess, the future of education with AI. Are we in an extraordinary time because of AI? And, how does that relate to an oikophobic civilization?
Yeah. So technology, I guess the more broader point first, generally is something that works as a fuel for oikophobia. Not oikophobia itself, but technology leads to a greater exposure to other traditions, and it leads to a term I used earlier, the democratization of knowledge, which excuse me, which tends to contribute to oikophobia in the sense that the more information people have, it leads to an illusion of expertise. And if one has the illusion of it, real expertise is something that is gained through a lifetime of study, as actual experts know. And actual experts, of course, know how little they know, because they know how the vast amount of knowledge, even just in their own delineated field, there is, and how hopeless it is to think that one could ever conquer all of that knowledge. So expertise is difficult to attain, but the illusion of expertise is one that comes through technology. We have it through the printing press, of course, in Reformation Europe, where there are sources who discuss how people who've read the Bible in a printed book in German translation for the first time in their lives will stop professional theologians and clergymen on the street and argue with them, which can be a positive thing, of course, but it is this illusion of expertise, which then leads to a questioning of received wisdom, a questioning of tradition, and of course the internet is as much of a case of that as anything. The idea that, okay, within a few seconds I can have almost any piece of information at my fingertips, therefore I can argue with experts, therefore I can reject received wisdom. So again, it's a double-edged sword. I appreciate that it leads to a greater interest in these questions, but yes, it also contributes to, or can contribute to oikophobia, to rejection of tradition, even other things. I mean, the trireme advancement in trireme technology by the Athenians led to greater exposure for them to foreign cultures, which, of course, through that way had a diluting effect, if you will, on their traditions. So that comes in many forms. Specifically, but again, as so many other things, as a double-edged sword. When it comes to AI in particular, I think maybe it's a bit early to say. I could see AI is something that is going to be used for both good and bad, obviously, and it's going to be used for both oikophobic and patriotic ends. One positive thing that I see with AI right now, apart from the obvious things, obviously, that AI can help with many different tasks, is that because of the AI race that exists now between the United States and China and other countries, there is a bit of that fuels a certain international competition, which is to say a certain patriotism. And so there is, if we suddenly realize that, there is a danger from China in winning the AI race, well, that means we here in the United States have to make a greater effort to build up American capacity. And so that actually has a positive effect, I think, in that sense. But AI, sorry?
The only problem with that is we becomes us and Sam Altman from OpenAI. These
right.
terrible oikophobes. It's hard to
Yeah.
coalesce around it. But point taken.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. I don't know. I mean, I know who he is, of course, but I don't know him so well in terms of some of the maybe perhaps more outlandish things he has said. But I can certainly imagine some of those things. I guess maybe the saving grace would be that some of those people, even if they are oikophobic themselves, they're also interested in personal self-aggrandizement and building up their own profiles and their own capacities, and that might at least benefit the United States through in that way, even if that's not the express intention. But a broader problem, of course, with AI is educational, that it can undermine knowledge of our own traditions, in the sense that, well, AI just gives us everything we want on a silver platter. No need to learn anything anymore. No need to learn how to read and write. Well, maybe to read, but not to write. And no need to perform actual research. The beauty of real research is, of course, is that you don't know where it's going to lead you. You go into a library, you find a book, and you read the book, and you realize, oh, this is interesting. This reminds me, oh, because of what I just read here, now I want to go to another book and look that up. And it's this kind of beautiful self-perpetuating process, a genuine research. Whereas AI, you just want one single piece of information, it gives it to you, and then you're done. So that is also that's certainly a danger with AI. The fact that genuine knowledge of our traditions is going to continue to peter out. That's of course a problem that has existed long before AI, but I think AI might accelerate that, unfortunately. Yeah.
Great. Dr. Benedict Beckeld, thank you so much for joining.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.